Hey YouTube! So recently I've been getting a lot of questions asking me how I build on Hecarim. So if you guys have been keeping up at all with my videos or with my OPGGs, you'll notice that a lot of the time, the games that I'll be playing on Hecarim, the build varies a lot. Some games I'll go Phase Rush, or not Phase Rush, but some games I'll go Chainsword, other games I go Duskblade, other games I go Chem Tank, some games I rush Chainsword, other games I'll like rush Duskblade, other games I build Manmune, some games I don't, some games I go Death Sand second, right? So there's a lot of people have been asking me, when do I go which item, when do I go which build? So first we'll start with rune setup, right? The way that I view Hecarim is, it's on like a skill basis, right? So, the less skilled you are at Hecarim, the more you want to gravitate towards Conqueror, but the more skilled you become at the champion, the more you want to play Phase Rush. Just because Phase Rush allows you to get more, I guess, mobility, more, with the slow resist, right? You can actually catch up to enemy targets, you can run away from people, you can look for re-engage opportunities, right? Whereas with Conqueror, it's more so kind of an ult in and have as much damage and power as possible, right? If you're very new to the champion, I would recommend going Conqueror every game. If you're extremely experienced, I recommend Phase Rush every game. And if you're somewhere in the middle, then I recommend switching between Conqueror and Phase Rush. Conqueror more in like duelist kind of comps. Maybe if the enemy team has like a Diana jungle with a Yasuo mid. And then Phase Rush in more so comps where the enemy can run away. So like let's say Graves jungle with Victor mid. Things like that, right? So that's for rune setup, right? And now we'll get into the actual thing that you guys care about, which is itemization. So, first things first, starting items. Every game, no matter what happens, you will always be rushing Ionian Boots. Always, always, always. Red Smite, Blue Smite, if you're wondering, it's just like, it doesn't really matter. You can go Blue Smite every game, it's fine. But now so like, Blue Smite every game is like my go-to. You guys can copy me if you want to do Red Smite, you can. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. So, starting items, you always want to be going your Ionian Boots and your tier. Always, always, always. Try to back out early if you can with 1350 gold, and then you just get this spike right away. That way you can start stacking your Manamune, and you can have that completed for like third, maybe fourth item if you get enough like gold and stuff. Sometimes I have it stacked by second item if it's more of like a low tempo game and it gives you time, right? But you always want to build this. And as for why do you rush Ionian Boots, the reason why is just because it gives you CDR and it gives you 45 movement speed right away. So since Hecarim's passive gives him bonus AD if he builds MS, that's why rushing tier 2 boots is super good. And getting the CDR just means you can get your W off more, you can use your E more to travel between camps faster, more Qs for the damage, right? Lower cooldown on ults, so that's why it's super important. So now as for actual build. Your first back, you're always, after you get these two items, you are always going to want to build Caulfields every single time. Now, after your Caulfields, you can upgrade it into one of three options. You can either go Chainsword, you can go Black Cleaver, or you can go Duskblade, right? So these are the three kind of like first item options for Hecarim. And I'll tell you guys how I determine. So what I do is I'll sit here and I'll say, okay, does the enemy team have any kind of healing whatsoever? For example, if they have a Sylas mid or a Vlad top or their junglers playing, let's say, Conqueror Lee Sin, right? Any healing whatsoever, automatically it's Chainsword Rush. So always, 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 if they have healing, you go Chainsword. So yeah, so any kind of healing is always Chainsword, and Chainsword is kind of like the thing you're going to be doing 90% of your games anyways, just because rushing Chainsword gives you a lot of like ability haste, gives you a lot of damage, a lot of health. So getting it is just really good for Hecarim, since you don't really need a mythic, since you can abuse all these stats, right? So that's why always in most of my games I'm going for Chainsword Rush. Now the other options, right? Cleaver. The times that I'll go Cleaver first item is going to be if the enemy team has a lot of like tanks and they don't really have much healing. So imagine the enemy top laner, for example, locks in Ornn, the enemy jungler's Rammus, and then the enemy mid laner is something like Galio, right? This is a game where they have a lot of peel and they have a lot of tanks. So in a game like this, rushing Cleaver is extremely important, right? But I can honestly say that of all the times I played Hecarim, I've never had a situation where I've had to go Cleaver Rush as of yet. So Cleaver, it's an extremely rare thing, but you can do it sometimes. So now, Cleaver, usually, maybe we'll say that's like 5% of your games, right? Not even 5%, it's like 2% of your games. So this is just an extremely rare fringe thing that you're going to do very, very, very occasionally, right? And now, as for Duskblade, the times that you're going to want to build Duskblade, it's very specific. So you're going to build Duskblade if you already have an early lead, as well as if the enemy team has no healing, and you want to get the Death's Dance as soon as possible. So this is in games where you're going to want to go Dusk, Death's Dance, Rush. So imagine you're versus a full AD team comp, and you're already 2-0 off your first back. Then in a game like that, you can say, alright, I'm going to rush Duskblade since I already have a lead, and then I'm going to get Death's Dance second, so that I can tank versus the entire enemy team. And then once you have Duskblade, Death's Dance, then you can just get a Mana Immune third item, and you're completely 1v9, right? So Duskblade, I'll do it usually about like maybe 8% of my games. Again, it's not something that you really do too often, just because it's something that you can only really do if the enemy is either full AD or full AP. So imagine if they're full AD, you can do a Duskblade into Death's Dance, but if they're full AP, you can go Duskblade into Maw, right? And the reason why you want to rush Duskblade in those cases instead of Chainsword is because you can get your Mythic right away, and then you can get a resistance item that just counters the entire enemy team. So Duskblade Death's Dance is for countering the entire enemy team. So that's kind of like how I view it, right? So now as for second item. Now, what do we build second item? So for second item options, we're going to take this from the perspective that you're going to be going Chainsword Rush, just because, again, Chainsword is my most played and most used item. So we're going to look at Mana Immune. We're going to look at Death's Dance. We're going to look at Cleaver as well. And then we're going to look at Maw. Then we can also look at Chem Tank, Duskblade. And is that it? I feel like I might be missing one, so let me just say. You can do Eclipse as well. Or you can do Serpents. Alright. So these are all like the second item options, right? So you have Mana Immune, you have Death's Dance, Cleaver, Maw, Duskblade, Chem Tank, Eclipse, and Serpents. So now the games you're gonna want to run these. It really depends. So you're gonna go Mana Immune second if you're behind. Mana Immune if you're behind, and the enemy team is squishy. So the reason you're gonna do this is because your tier will be fully stacked by the time you get a second item, since you don't have a lot of gold, as well as the fact that when you're behind, you always want to build more aggressively, since you really want to get as much damage off as possible before you die. Because if you start building tank items, you're not really going to be able to tank much, but at least if you go full AD, then you can get a one-shot, right? So that's why Mana Immune second is if you're behind and the enemy team is squishy enough that you can one-shot them. Death's Dance is if the enemy team is still relatively squishy, and you can be ahead or behind, but they have to be primarily AD. So it works from ahead or behind, and then enemy squishy plus majority AD. So the reason why Death's Dance is a good second item option is not necessarily because you want to get it as a second item, but just more so because if you have it as a second item, you're very tanky for like the dragon fights and the Rift Herald fights that are going to occur. And then when you build your Mana Immune as a third item, then you can just one-shot everybody as well. And then with the Mana Immune, like having the Death's Dance and Mana Immune just makes it so your resets really powerful. So it's kind of like you're looking for an earlier defensive spike, because you have because the enemy team is like majority AD, right? So that's like what I'll do. I usually do Death's Dance second in like 20 to 30% of my games, not super often. So Cleaver second, this is similar to what I was saying earlier about the enemy having a lot of tanks, but the only time you're going to do Cleaver second is if the enemy team so imagine, for example, you're playing a game and the enemy team has like a Scion top, and then their jungler's Redcane and their mid laner Sylas. So that's a game where they have a very beefy front line, and there's no real good item to build second that can like counter them resistance wise. So you just want to counter them by having like a lot of flat HP, and then the Armor Shred also helps you push through their defensives so you can actually kill them. So Cleaver is about tanky enemy comp that can't be countered with one resist item. So if you can counter them with one resist item, then you're going to be doing Death's Dance second, right? So now as for Maw, it's the same exact thought process as Death's Dance, but instead of enemy team majority AD, it's majority AP. So ahead or behind, enemy team relatively squishy, and then they're majority AP. So that's when you're going to go Maw. So now as for Duskblade, this is the one that I usually run as a second item. And the times you're going to want to run this is if you have a lead early game and the enemy team has kind of like mixed damage, so you want to just go for an assassin mythic that can just one-shot everybody, right? So imagine they can't just straight up be countered with a Death's Dance or a Maw, but you have a big early lead and you still want to keep pushing it, then in games like that, you're going to be doing Duskblade second. So Duskblade second is for when you have a lead, and then enemy somewhat squishy, right? So Duskblade is lead and then enemy squishy. So as for Chem Tank second, you're going to want to be doing this. Chem Tank second is going to be done when you're very, very far behind and you can't really do much in your game, so you just want to be a utility bot for the rest of your team. This only really works if the enemy team is kind of like tankier and they already have a lead and your team is also fed, so you can kind of like play utility this game. So Chem Tank second is when you're behind and then team already has damage. So you can just commit for like more of a defensive route. And now Eclipse, I don't really build Eclipse anymore, I'm going to be honest with you guys. But you can use that as the same thought process as Duskblade. The only thing is if you feel not very comfortable with Duskblade because you don't like how the invisibility works, and you want more like upfront tankiness stats with the Eclipse's shield as well as its Omnivamp, then you can use that as a substitute. So Duskblade and Eclipse are kind of interchangeable. And now as for Serpent second is when you have a lead and then the enemy team has lots of shields. So the reason why you're going to want to do this is just so they can actually like kill them. Because if you go Chainsword into Serpents and they have things like Seraphine and Sona, then you can just counter them from second item at like 14 minutes. So things like that are really broken. As for the rest of it, these are the ways you're going to kind of want to determine your early game, right? So your first two items are going to be determined by... So we said the first two items are they going to be Chainsword, Cleaver, or Duskblade. And the reason why earlier I didn't mention Eclipse is just because I feel like Duskblade is better than Eclipse because it gives CDR. So that's why I haven't really been building it as much, even though I'm the one who innovated the build, right? So now as for third item options, you just want to use the same kind of like thought process as here, right? So ask yourself, does the enemy team have any of these? And if the answer is yes to any of these, then you just build it, right? So imagine you have your Chainsword and you have your Death's Dance. Do they also have like... Did you build your Death's Dance because their AD was fed early and now their AP is starting to get a lead? Go Maw next, right? Do you still have the lead that you had earlier? Just finish your Duskblade. Or did you get kind of behind after building it? Then just go Chem Tank, right? So it's like... You just want to kind of take it as it goes, right? And now I'll just put all the kind of like item options that you can build on this champion as well, in case you guys are wondering. Versus heavy AD, Death's Dance is good. Deadman's is also good, but nowadays I don't really build any straight up defensive items. Like, you'll look at my OPGG and you'll notice that items like Force of Nature, Spirit Visage, and Deadman's, I never build them. And the reason why is because with Riot buffing Hecarim's AD ratios, you don't really want to build any raw tank items, because you always want to be getting at least a little bit of AD from the items you build, right? So that's why if you ever need like a QSS, then you can go Silvermirror Dawn. It's better than Mercurial because you don't really need the crit stat, but this is only really good if the enemy team has like a Malzahar or something, or a Mordekaiser, right? If they don't have that, then you should never really be looking to build this item. So that's kind of like it for Hecarim itemization. Usually your build is going to consist of a mixture of these 6 items, and you just kind of like take it as the game goes depending on what the enemy team has, right? So just always keep in mind, what does an item actually do, and does that item help me this game? That's how you always need to view it. If they have a lot of AD, that's Dance. If they have a lot of tanks, you can go Cleaver. If they have a lot of shields, Serpents, right? So just always like think about how the game is going, and then depending on how the game is going, the beauty of Hecarim is that he doesn't have to build a mythic as a first, second, third, or even fourth item. So just always take the game one item at a time, depending on what you feel like you need in your team fights. So now, for the people that are going to ask about, what about Sunder? What about Trinity Force? No. Right? Simple as that. No. You don't want to build any of these two items. And the reason why is because skilled Hecarim players, their damage comes from their Q. They're going to be going in team fights, they're going to be running around using their Q. And since your Q is a buff thing, why would you ever want to waste your time sitting there and like Q auto, Q auto, Q auto, right? So that's why, just straight up no. If you're building Sunder or Trinity Force, I'm going to assume that's because you're new to the champion and you're going to be going like a Conqueror setup and you just want to have like a lot of tank stats. You're like, oh, let me go Sunder into Frozen Heart. But let me tell you, if you're actually a Hecarim player, you're going to end so many games by building these two items and you're always going to be super worthless. So just stay away from these two items and always keep your build somewhat of a mixture of these ones. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, be sure to leave a like, sub if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Peace.